right, welcome back everyone. What we have a tendency to find out is that when we delve into interest, which is, if you think of it as a figurative iceberg, the tip of the iceberg is the positions of what people say they want. I want a raise, or I want better working conditions. People's positions, they're very upfront with. The submerged part of the iceberg is why do they want those things? And when you see that people are not on the same page, it may be that once you get beyond the initial statement of what you say you want, not being on the same page is very much consumed by the reasons driving that position. And we're going to unpack that today. We started with distributive negotiations, and in terms of negotiations, I think that's one of the more clear-cut types of framework. That is, you have a fixed pie, and the more of the resources that you gather, the less the other person gets. And just by way of review, for distributive negotiations, it's very much a win-lose. And so that the more that I get, the less you get. And I said that there are three primary questions that drive negotiations. How important is the outcome? What are my long-term goals? How important is the relationship? And distributive negotiations have a tendency to focus on how important is the outcome. And the example that I gave you of buying the dog and wanting to get it at the cheapest price. The out of mini lecture example that I gave you was a bit more complex in that you were trying to figure out of the available offices or the floors, who would get what. And in going into that negotiation, you could have very much focused on, I want to make sure my entire team is on the 10th floor. However, how important is the relationship? Do you need that other department? Over the tenure of your career with the company, would going with a very aggressive or a hardball approach jeopardize the relationship? So if the outcome, if being on the 10th floor was the most important thing to you, then you might have adopted a distributive mindset. Now, when we talked about distributive negotiation, we also talked about some key terminology. Target price, meaning in this case, what was the ideal package that you wanted? It may have been, I want my entire team to be on the floor. I don't want to have to go back into the lottery. I don't want the second floor, and I don't want half the team on the second floor and half the team on the 10th floor. So your target might have been, and that's the optimal result, my entire team there. What would you have settled for being your reservation or your resistance price? And it might have been, out of the 85 offices, if I can have 30 of them, there are several conference rooms, it's important to me that I have at least 2 of them. What, given the needs of your department, could you settle for? And then, how did you make the first offer? And in distributive negotiations, we talked about the importance of stepping into the shoes of the other side. What do we think is most important to them? And before you lay out your package, what questions can you ask? How often do you have meetings? How important might the conference rooms be to them? How important is the 10th floor to them in general? Are they open to splitting up their team? Before you make your initial offer in distributive negotiations and in all negotiations, ask questions about the other side. Last week, I talked about how people have a tendency to verbally vomit all over the other side. Ew, I'm right. I want what I want. There are many unknowns going into a negotiation. However, what you know the most about is your own position. And this is very tough for me. So that means I need to shut up and find out more about the other side. Because if I find out that they never bring in outside vendors or use the conference rooms for team meetings, then That might be something that I could offer as a concession. It sounds like you don't really have much use for meetings. So in the back of my mind, I would file that away. If for some reason I get stuck on the second floor, can I have the meeting? Can I have the 10th floor for conference rooms? Or vice versa. If conference rooms aren't important to me, I might say, you know, I value this relationship. It sounds like conference rooms are really important to you. And it sounds like even if you get all of the conference rooms on one floor, that's not enough. We're willing to give you our conference room space to allow you to use them on the 10th and the second floor in exchange for having all of our offices located on the 10th floor. So in distributive negotiations, it's very important. Find out what is important to the other side. Are there things that aren't that big a deal to you that you could offer up as a concession? So one of the big things we talk about in negotiation, whether it's distributive or integrative, is this concept of concessions. And that is when you go into a negotiation, what are things that you're willing to give up and put them in a ranking? And you may start out with a small concession in the beginning to open up or establish an element of trust. When things become contentious in a negotiation, you might offer up a negotiation to help de-escalate rising emotions. Another straight strategy is straight up tactic here is how are you in face-to-face as opposed to online negotiations? How are you sitting? I highly recommend against sitting directly across from the other person. When you do that, it puts us in a very antagonistic posturing. You become the problem. I recommend sitting to the side. Another strategy, how is value captured in negotiations, meaning offers that are being made, concessions being made. In our very tech-attached environment, people have a tendency to hide behind their laptops talking. If you've ever gone in for a doctor's appointment, or at least my doctor now comes in with this little smart cart, and he's asking me my medical history, and he's typing away furiously. In terms of developing a connection or rapport, the laptop is between us, which hinders that. I highly recommend, if at all possible, go into negotiations old school, either with a closed laptop or with paper and pen. When conversations or offers are made, write them down and have the piece of paper in front of you where both sides can see it. That way, as emotions begin to rise. So Debbie said something that I found objectionable. In a traditional negotiation setting, if Debbie is seated directly across from me, I'm like, Debbie, that was the dumbest thing I ever heard. She becomes the recipient of my anger, which increases the emotion. If we're sitting off to the side of each other and there's a piece of paper in between us, I direct that emotion to the piece of paper. This, what you suggested right here, makes no sense. The paper, something external to the individual, absorbs the emotion and has a tendency to prevent negotiations from escalating in terms of hostility. In addition, what I like about having a piece of paper, or if I'm in a conference room, a whiteboard in front of me, is there are times when there's a power imbalance in a negotiation. And there are times in negotiations when people have, let's say, difficulty remembering things the same way I did. I am not allowed to call someone out on their dishonesty. What I found, however, is when offers are made and you write them down on a piece of paper visible to both sides, it has a tendency to make people more accountable to their words. So instead of me saying, Bobby, that is just not true. Bobby, did I write this down incorrectly? And that has a tendency to, in a power imbalance where it's perhaps inappropriate for you to call someone out, keep things, let's say, more courteous and make people more accountable to the things that come out of their mouth. So in a distributive type negotiation, those are things that I'm very much inclined to use. In addition, for group meetings, if there's going to be a whiteboard and people are writing things and things are going to be written down, I will always volunteer to be the scribe. And people seem to be comfortable with that. Why is that? I volunteer to be the scribe because that Post-it or that piece of paper is going to become the memorialization of what is said during the meeting. Some things are going to get written down, some things aren't. If Betsy says something and I don't like it, ooh, hand cramp, that one doesn't get written down. If she says something that I like, but I want to tweak it a little, I'm going to capture the essence of what Betsy has said from my perspective. And that whiteboard, that Post-it then becomes what people refer back to. So don't be afraid to be in charge of what gets written down. I told you my approach. Okay, so in terms of background and review of distributive negotiations, those were the things that I wanted to hit. I'd like to now transition into integrative negotiations. And what's important about integrative negotiations is what we will find in life, most things are a combination of the two. And if you have the opportunity to take an intermediate or an advanced negotiation class, you will see how to blend these two approaches together and combine issues such that you pull from both sides. But in our limited time together, I want to talk about integrative negotiations. And I think of that as like the kumbaya approach. Now, the outcome here I have is win-win. And that's how the literature refers to it. But I don't like that. The concept of win-win still connotes some type of competition. And integrative negotiation, when done well, is not a competition at all. It's a conversation where both sides increase their understanding such that both sides' primary interests are met. Now, going back to those three questions, how important is the outcome? What are your long-term goals? How important is the relationship? I like integrative negotiations because while keeping in mind the outcome, you don't want to take a bath in any negotiation. This allows for the relationship and your long-term goals to suffer minimal, if any, damage. So it's worth delving into. Now, similar to distributive negotiation, there's terminology associated with this. When we talk about integrative negotiations, we talk about positions, interests, BATNA, Plan B, I already talked about, but I'll go over it again, alternatives and protocols. The alternatives and the protocols, that's straight strategy, and we'll get into that if I can manage to shut up in enough time for us to get to that. But if not, we'll start at the next class. All right, so you have position, that's what you want, what you will do, what you won't do, your interests for why you want those things, your BATNA, Plan B, the alternatives, and the protocols. We have a little example that we're going to walk you through, but before we get to that, oh yeah, a story about me, because I like talking about me. I'm a bad driver, and if I haven't shared that with you before, yeah, it's just true. If it moves, I hit it. And because I'm a bad driver, I don't like driving down to DC. And on occasion, I have a class in DC. The class is at 6 o'clock, but I get so stressed about getting to DC that I leave at 2 o'clock. It decreases the possibility that I will hit things, USAA is already threatening to drop me. So seriously, I'm a bad driver. It just is. Anyway, I got my teaching schedule and I found that I was teaching in DC during, for us, spring 2. And spring 2 starts in March, and this particular year, we're having a very bad winter. So I told my husband, can you believe it? I have to teach in DC. To which he responded, huh, that was not the response I was looking for. So in my infinite maturity, I was like, you know what, Brian? When I come home from teaching in DC, I want dinner on the table. I cook 5 days out of the week. When it's your turn to cook, you order the kids pizza, but I want dinner on the table. Now that was my position. And I'm a lawyer, he's a lawyer. If he'd engaged me on the position level, I was ready for him. I carried twins for you. I eat your mom's gross green Jell-O at Thanksgiving. We would have, at the position level, gone back and forth. Brian's been married to me for 17 years. He's like, all right, Stace. I was like, that's right, all right. So I go to class, I come back, and by the time I get home, it's 10 o'clock. And I go into the kitchen, and the lights are dimmed. I was like, ooh, little mood. So I go over to where I sit, and I hate anchovies. This will be relevant in 2 seconds. And where I sit, there's a pizza box, and grease has soaked through the lid of the pizza box. I open it up. There's one piece of congealed anchovy pizza with a bite out of it. In terms of my position, I want dinner on the table. I got what I said I wanted. But was it about dinner at all? No. My interests. What do I want? What do I need? What are my hopes, fears, and concerns? What was this really about? Because do I eat at 10 o'clock at night? No. Could I have stopped by and gotten something on the way home if I was dying for food? Yeah. What it was about for me was when I have to drive home, I talk a lot. I just do. The kids go to bed at 8:30. At that time, they went to bed at 8:30. So from 8:30 until 10 o'clock, my husband was in the family room drinking a Guinness, reading The Atlantic, listening to Radiohead, while I am white knuckling it home, praying that I don't hit one more car, because then I really am kicked off the insurance. His response of, huh, annoyed me. So what was it really about, dinner on the table? I wanted to feel appreciated. The next Tuesday when I came home, again, the lights were low in the kitchen. I was like, wow, he is really pushing it. I go over to where I sit, and there's a glass of Chardonnay. Aw, isn't he sweet? To me, he met my interests. That glass of wine said, hey, Stace, didn't get a call from USAA. Clearly you didn't hit anything. I know you hate driving at night in inclement weather. Here's a glass of wine. Integrative negotiations is all about delving beneath the often explosive positions that people assert. If you look at Congress, if you look at the world of politics as a whole right now, people are so entrenched in their position. And if you engage them on that level, you will hit a stone wall. Integrative negotiations allows for us to find out why people want what they want. And that understanding puts more Legos on the table. So Susan's negotiating with her union, and they're like, you know, we want breaks every 20 minutes. Breaks every 20 minutes? That makes no sense. Now, if we can go back and forth about this. So why are breaks so important to you? Breaks are important to you because, you know what? With COVID going on right now, I feel that people put on the front lines, people put in dangerous positions, it's always us, and we're tired of it. So to me, that says, how can I make you feel that you're a more valued part of this organization? How can we show for you our respect or put your safety first? Is it about the brakes? Not really. It's about so much more, the submerged part of the iceberg. Integrative negotiations invite you to ask questions to understand why people want the things that they want. And if you can meet those submerged needs and interests, people's death grip on their position begins to lessen. I did not want dinner on the table. I just wanted my husband to say, wow, I know you hate driving to DC. Here's a glass of wine. All right. So what would this look like in real life? The little scenario is we have two colleagues and there's one office. And they've been doing, yeah, I like renovations. There's an office, one has a window, one doesn't. And the department head is kind of an absentee department head. And he's like, hey, figure out who gets the window with the office and who gets the windowless office. And they're both about the same size. Now, colleague A, that's this person, not only currently has a lab with a window, a new software package, and a parking spot. Colleague B has nothing. Their plan B is they can both they're both in windowless offices as it stands. So their plan B, their fallback position is colleague A can stay in a windowless office, but their lab has a window, so, you know, that's not too bad. They've got a key parking spot, and they have software. Colleague B, their plan B, just to stay in the crappy office. The position, both people want the window. Now, the initial approach might be to think of this as a distributive negotiation. I want the window, you want the window. There's only one office, so someone's going to be a loser. And yes, you can approach negotiations that way, but I invite you to take an integrative approach to this negotiation. So a distributive approach would be, hey, I want it, you want it. We could flip a coin. We could go to the department head, but we could rotate perhaps. You get it on the odd months, I get it on the even months. All revolves around one office and someone getting it. An integrative approach asks us to delve deeper. So Susan, why is the office with the window important to you? And for colleague B, it could be, you know, I have seasonal affective disorder and I really need a window. Okay, I'm sorry to hear that. Here's one of those big lights, you know, that you can like stare into, and it gives you what I'm not a scientist, but it gives you all the like light that you need. Would that meet your, oh, well, no, I like the fresh air. So by asking, can you meet those needs? Yes, most negotiations can be either distributive or integrative. Skillful negotiators will keep it out of the distributive realm. Sometimes, however, it's not possible. Or if I'm getting a car, I'm fine with it being distributive. I want to pay as little as possible. The more money I keep in my pocket, the less you keep in yours, and I'm okay with that. Dinner on the table, I would like to stay married. So taking a distributive approach where I focus on, damn it, dinner on the table may not suit well for my long-term interests. So both people want the window. In integrative negotiations, we focus on the why. Why do you want the window? And you may find for colleague B, you know what? You have the key parking spot, you've got software, you already have a window in your lab. You know, the office with the window isn't as important to me as, geez, it seems like you get everything. And that kind of ticks me off. So I'm sick of seeing you grab, grab, grab. Now, what's really interesting about that is I've done a couple things. So one, it may not be about the office at all, but colleague B has made a ton of assumptions. So Debbie, all you do is grab. And Debbie's response is, the parking lot was alphabetical and my last name is Brenly. So I was just next up. In terms of the software, I had a grant and it came as part of that. Oh, so I guess Debbie's not a jerk after all. When you go into negotiations, especially if you come in with a distributive point of view, you have a tendency to go in with a set of assumptions. I assumed that Debbie works the system, is constantly looking out for herself, and has amassed all of these things. For me to ask questions, I have to do it with an open mind. What would I need to hear from Debbie when I ask questions to disabuse me of these thoughts? And before I make an offer, before I begin negotiating, I need to test my assumptions. Because if I go in thinking that Debbie is aggressive and grabs things, she may make a legitimate offer to me, but I can't hear her because I assume she's a jerk. So, hey, Debbie, I see that you have software. How'd you get that? Oh, it's part of the grant. What about, I heard you have a lab with a window in it already? Oh, sure. You know, I'm really good at negotiating. Now, geez, Debbie, do you think you could help me with your negotiation skills? Get software? And what's unique about that is, I'm not asking her to give up her software. I'm not asking her to give up her parking. If she is good at something, I'm asking her to share her skills with me. And here's the thing. If I think Debbie's a jerk, probably other people think Debbie's a jerk. So I could help rehabilitate her perception. So think through your negotiations. So what do you want? What are your hopes? What are your needs? And what are their interests? If I feel as colleague B that colleague A gets everything and that I've been marginalized or that people don't see me as a go-getter, are there ways that colleague A can help me feel empowered? Are there ways that you can meet some of those underlying interests of mine? Now, in terms of the office itself, I invite you guys to think expansively. If the two offices are next to each other and they're doing renovation, can't they just knock the wall down and make one huge office? Perhaps, might be, I work by myself all the time. I don't mind working with someone. It could be that I travel a lot, so I'm not in the office all that much anyway. What I invite you to do with integrative negotiations is to expand the conversation enough so that I know what you're about. And if you're like, hey, I don't like you, Stacy, and the idea of being in the office with you is not attractive to me at all, okay. Is there a way that you could perhaps, you can have the office with the window. Can I have your lab space? Because that has a window. So think creatively. And don't be afraid to bring other things outside of the negotiation into the negotiation. So Betsy, I know you do a lot of like data stuff. I've got software that could be very helpful. The office is pretty important to me. I'd be more than happy to get you software and parking in exchange for me getting the office. Now, that's a nice way to do it. If I'm colleague B, I'm going to play on colleague A's guilt. Bobby, the amount of things that you have, it's just an embarrassment of riches. So let me get this straight. You got a lab with a window, you got a close parking spot, and you get off at 4 o'clock. I don't get off till 11 o'clock, but hey, don't worry about it. And you have the software? I'm just trying to make sure I understand everything. I may try to leverage those things as guilt to make Bobby feel so bad about herself that she offers up the office. If I were Bobby and being a jerk, I'd say, that's not what this negotiation is about. This negotiation is very much about the window. So framing is important. If there's a negotiation, then I think there must be some degree of power on each side. There is power on each side. What's interesting to me is how people, because they fall into assumptions, may limit their perception of their power. Going into this negotiation, both sides are equal. When I do this negotiation in class, students often feel that colleague A has more power. There's one office, both have 50-50 right to the office. But because you know that colleague A has software and parking, you're like, wow, they must be really good at it. Maybe the department chair favors them, and that's how they got all that. I have, through the narrative that I've created around these facts, diminished my power. Ask questions to dispel things like that. All right. When we talk about integrative negotiations, you want to figure out, what do you want from the negotiation, the process, the relationship? What do you really need, and how will you feel if you get what you were asking for? I got dinner on the table. The half-eaten anchovy pizza did not make me feel good. More importantly, you need to figure out, what do they want from the process, from the relationship? And one of the best ways to do that is to ask questions. Yeah, Stacey, you've been saying ask questions. How do we do that? Funny you should ask. There are a couple of different approaches that I like to get good questions. Now, again, by way of full disclosure, I'm a litigator. So my approach to questioning is very much informed by or influenced by my prior career. I have to admit, though, I became much better at questioning and integrative negotiation once I had kids. You're just supposed to be more understanding in theory. Anyway, in terms of questioning, adopt scientific inquiry. And I gave you this example last time. Researchers, doctors, a variety of professions have the ability to ask really good questions. I go in, I've got 15 minutes with my primary care provider. It hurts here. Well, yes, it hurts here, but the pain is really coming from lower in your back. They can drill down and ask questions. So the ability to ask questions from a patient is not encumbered by, am I going to hurt their feelings? Are they going to think I'm smart? Is that too personal? Am I being bossy? That scientific inquiry, that objective ability allows you to ask effective questions. Bring that skill set to negotiations. People have a tendency to, oh, I don't want to seem pushy, or, geez, I never thought to ask that. In the beginning, write your questions down ahead of time. Ask open-ended questions. I now have teenagers. Oh, good God, they're awful. Anyway, with teenagers, all the parenting books say, to affect good communication with your teen, do not ask yes or no questions, because that's the response you get. So, Betsy, does that make sense? Yes. Boom, end of conversation. Ask open-ended questions. Betsy will tell me more about herself if I ask questions. Betsy, those look like really interesting crafts behind you. Can you tell me about them? The more she tells me about herself, the more I find out what her interests are. The more I find out about her interests, Are there ways I can meet what's important to Betsy? Because if I can do that, she will let go of her death grip on her position. But if I come straight at her on her position, she's going to hunker down. I like this one, and it's, you guys are old enough, the Siskel and Ebert approach, the critique of your proposal. People love to give their opinions. So, Philippe, I've given you, here's my approach for how we divvy up the office. He looks at it, he's like, oh, holy cow, that's not going to work. And he's going to zero in on the aspect of my proposal that butts up against his primary interest. In critiquing my proposal, in telling me what's wrong with it, he is telling me what's important to him. Now, what's interesting in research, people don't have a problem with that. I have a theory, I write a paper, Betsy's like, wow, that paper sucked, and this is why. And she, through the lens of what's important to her, is going to dismantle or address my argument. I don't take it personally. It's research, it's scholarship, no big deal. Well, I do a little, but you know, I'm trying to look mature. In our negotiations, can you do the same thing? Can you give someone a proposal and accept their honest feedback? And the feedback is, as they critique your proposal, they are telling you what's important to them. Another approach I like a lot is, hey, Debbie, I'm really on a roll right now. And I figure if we go till 2 o'clock, woo, I could cover so much. On 1 being, hell no, not doing it, to 10 being, sure, I can start day drinking. This could be a lot of fun. Where are you? And Debbie's like, I'm like a 2, which is not hell no, because she doesn't swear, clearly, but it's a pretty strong no. All right, fine. Is there anything I could offer you to get you to a 3? Which is clearly still, you're not staying till 2. I got that. But just a little closer. Debbie's like, yeah, you could have told me ahead of time. Okay, so what I'm hearing from you is scheduling and respect for your time is very important. Okay, so for our next session, if I can get the links out correctly, remember to put the Zoom link in there and get everything else right, and give you the opportunity to stay a half an hour later. If you have advance notice, that could get you to a 3. Debbie's like, I'm still not staying. Hey, you are still not staying. Yeah, that might get me to a 3. Is there anything I can offer you to get you to a 4? And again, we are not talking about extending time until you're at an 8. So this is, you are still firmly in the no category. As I slowly, incrementally take her up the scale, she is telling me what's important to her. Respect for her time. Food delivered to her house so she can like not have to get off the call and eat during our massive session. All of these things, I like to think of it as put Legos on the table, which, wait for it, help us build a bridge to agreement. The more I find out about Debbie, the more aspects I have to meet her interests, because that's what I really want to do. That or get her off the position of, hell no, we're not staying. All right. Once you begin to find out what people value, you will see that there are complementary issues. There are things that we both want. There are opportunities, just different interests. And I like different interests because if Debbie values something that I really don't care about, she's like, you know, I would stay, but I'd like additional articles. I don't care about that. That's just having my TA post more articles online. She's like, you know, we're not going to get to culture negotiations. And I'd really like some information on that. Okay, that's just a different interest. I am willing to do that in exchange for and I want to just go back to concessions. When you make a concession, when you give someone something they want, there's a process to doing it. And I can't remember if I told you this already, so I'll just pretend like I didn't. Specifically say what you want and explain to the other side what the concession, what you giving this up means to you. And this is why I think I told you again. When I was a little kid, my mom would make my lunch, and it just occurred to it, I just assumed that her whole reason for living was to make my lunch every night, cut the crusts off the bread, cut it on the diagonal, put a little note in there, hey, Stace, I love you, put it in a little snack pack, put it in a bag with a little heart on it, and put it in the fridge. Karma is something. But anyway, she never complained about it, so I didn't value it. I opened the fridge, my lunch was there. That's what moms do. Ha! Oh my gosh, it's a pain. Anyway, if my mom had said, you know, Stace, I could be watching Magnum PI tonight. However, you having a wholesome lunch is important to me. So every night I make your lunch. Now I understand what she was giving up. Stace, in exchange for making your lunch, I would appreciate it if you make your bed. Name what you want in return. So when you give up something, when you make a concession, the person needs to value it. They don't value something if it's too freely given. So explain what you were giving up. And then, unless you want like ugly ties for Father's Day for the rest of your life, name what you want in return. So in exchange, Debbie, for posting the articles on culture negotiation on the OneDrive, I would appreciate if you, boom, stayed for 15 minutes extra. Name. So for concessions, explain what you're giving up, give them whatever it is that you feel comfortable giving, and then name what you want in return. Once you've found out what people are interested in, you will see that some things are complementary. If you both want the same things and you find that out ahead of them, you can use it one of two ways. One way is, I could take the office, but we're going to be colleagues together because you guys already have tenure and I hope to have tenure. Since we're going to be working together, you take the office. And I hope that sometime in the future, if I ever need anything, I could come to you for help. But take it. So if we find, it could be you can find complementary interest, naming it, to build trust or rapport, to further a long-term goal or to enhance the relationship. Or if you're a little slimy, kind of like me, I might say, hey, so you want the office? And I didn't really want the office. Wow. I'm willing to give it to you, but again, I really need my vitamin D. But I'll give it to you in exchange for that cool painting over your head. Because clearly you have fewer walls. So I've got more wall space because I have no windows. And that would look great behind my desk. So I've explained the cost and I've asked for something in return. And it's a complementary interest in that I didn't care about the office anyway, but I leveraged it to get something that I want. And then there's challenges, which is conflicting interests. Standards. It is important to, if I'm trying to convince the other side of something, what do they value in terms of being credible? For football, and I'm not a big sports fan, but for football, they figure out who's going to be the kickoff and the receiving team by flipping a coin. Everyone, whether you like the results or not, everyone buys into the process of flipping a coin as fair. As a lawyer, in theory, the plaintiffs and the defendants both agree that the law is fair, that the case law, the cases that we will rely on are credible, and we both value that. If I'm trying to convince Betsy of something, what type of data, what type of standards does she buy as credible? Because if I try to convince her with something that she does not value, I'm getting nowhere. So spend time What do both sides, maybe it's joint commission stuff, what do both sides value as a credible, legitimate way to solve the dispute? Ethics. The bottom line here is don't screw other people. It's not a nice thing to do. Yeah, that's all you get on that column. Protocols. The who, what, when, where, and why. Who needs to be at the meeting? And be open to the idea that you may not be the best person to negotiate with. Susan can't stand me. I could come up with the vaccine for Corona, and if it's coming out of my mouth, Susan doesn't want to hear it. However, Susan really likes Chrissy. I gotta let my ego step aside. Hey, Chrissy, can you negotiate with Susan? Because you're credible to her. She will listen to you. So think, who needs to be there? When should the negotiation take place? Susan is very grumpy without her coffee in the morning. So an 8 o'clock meeting might not make a lot of sense. Think about that. The agenda. Just like the whiteboard, I like being in charge of the agenda. If there are issues that I don't want to get to, I will make them the last item on the agenda. And if you've been in our faculty meetings, they will run out before we get to that. If we need to vote on something and Susan can't stand me, but she's always late, it's going to be the first item on the agenda. As soon as we have a quorum, boom, we're doing the vote. So here's the deal. You've now come to an agreement. We've decided that we didn't take a negotiation course. So we decided that we would switch the offices every 2 weeks. So it was a dumb idea, but we thought that that would make sense. Oh my goodness gracious. Susan's not living up to her agreement. And I'm just getting more and more annoyed. I am a huge fan of post-settlement settlements. What does that look like? Hey, Susan, I think we've done a pretty good job coming up with a solution to this negotiation. But let's set up a meeting 6 months from now. And our BATNA is, our plan B, we will stick with the agreement that we have. But if in the intervening 6 months, something comes up, we need to tweak it, let's agree to sit down and see how things are going. Now, in the heady afterglow of us just hammering out a negotiation, we're going to feel pretty good about ourselves. We think we've come up with a great agreement, switching offices every 2 weeks. So sure, we put it on in Outlook. In 6 months, we're going to sit down. What does that do for me? When August rolls around, and I am so pissed off because it was my week, I was on vacation, but I came back early, and Susan's in the office on my week because she thought I wasn't going to be there. Oh yeah, I'm writing this down. In 4 months, when we sit down for our meeting, we are so going to talk about this. It allows me to keep my emotions in check because I know there is a predetermined time for us to sit down and go through this. So putting up with Susan being shady is okay with me because I know that there's a release valve scheduled. 6 months might be too long. Find out an appropriate time to check in. So I highly, as a negotiator, I highly recommend those. As an attorney, I hate those because you're trying to undo my legal agreement, but whatever. It also keeps me further employed, but something to think and keep in mind. Last 2 minutes. Key strategies in integrative negotiations. Again, just like people who evoke in me some need to hug them in return. Start out a negotiation by being open, by being trustworthy, by sharing some small piece of information that you don't have to, that opens the door and invites them to respond in kind. Ask questions. What I want to make sure that you don't fall into the trap of is thinking that being integrative means focusing only on long-term relationships, on compromising what you want, or being overly nice. I am none of those things. And I do integrative negotiations all the time. This is a comparison of distributive and integrative negotiations that show you some of the tension or how the two are different. And then what we will start out with next time, in addition to the scaled score approach to asking questions, we will get into two what I think are very good strategies for asking questions. And they're all centered around the funnel approach. You start very open, and then as the negotiation progresses, you get more focused in your questioning. And we'll talk briefly about window questions, which is my favorite. Anyway, we will get into the specifics of how to ask effective questioning, and one of the most important tools in fueling your ability for shared understanding. And that is, oftentimes a negotiation will be dominated by a word. When I talk to my kids, that's not fair. What does fair look like to you? If there's a term or a concept that keeps coming up repeatedly in a negotiation, have the other side define what it means to them. And that definition could be radically different than what mine is. So we're both using the same word, and our emotions are escalating because we believe the other side just isn't getting it. Window questions really focus on getting an explanation, and as they explain, they're telling you what their values are and what their interests are and how it is wrapped up or represented in that term.